is a naturally entrepreneurial country. Part of it is because it is an immigrant country, but it's sort of in the DNA of the United States. And I was listening to that last panel and just thinking, we're doing great harm to the next generation of firm builders and entrepreneurs if that's where the K-12 education system is right now. So that's another area that we should be looking at for reform.
I mean, that's a great point. I have 3 kids fully immersed in that K through 6 right now, and I wonder, going back to a comment in the very first panel today, if the inequities in our educational system are driving that. We talk an awful lot about building creativity into the curriculum and into the classroom experience, and I wonder if you guys could comment on we're sitting in a school district here in Marion County where maybe a third of students enter 4th grade without the capacity really to read at that anywhere near that level. And nationwide, about 1 in 7 students enter 4th grade unable to read. And so how do we reconcile the very rigorous test-based curriculum at that K through 4, which is failing those students in some way, with the need to take students who can read at 4th grade into a very creativity-based, much looser, more resource-intensive environment because I teach in the Honors College and the College of Business. It's a lot harder teaching in that Honors College than teaching that industrial economics class because one's free thinking. Is there a reconciliation here? Is there a public policy dimension to this?
I'll take a stab at that. First, I think it's important to defend some aspects of the education of America's K-12 education system, namely that it can't do everything, right? I mean, that students come into a school with a socioeconomic background, with natural endowments, with a home environment that's not of their own, that they don't control and that the school doesn't control. And a school has to do what it can with that, and they can only pull so many rabbits out of a hat. And a lot of schools are doing the best that they can. I genuinely believe that. That said, the U.S. education system, at least the K-12 system, is largely insulated from competition and the rigors that competition bring. We talked a lot about innovation today, and we've heard a lot about it. We haven't heard that much about the role that competition plays in driving innovation. It's impossible to think about innovation in any sector if you have a monopoly sector, which is in effect what you have with a lot of K-12 education in the United States. So if we're looking for reforms, we should be looking for some reforms that absolutely respect what K through 12 educators are trying to do in this country, but also understand that unless you're in an ecosystem that has some competitive pressure that forces you to innovate, to take risks, to experiment, you're not going to do those things. And that's part of why we don't have that. And so instead, we have a federal law, No Child Left Behind, or No Child Untested, as the previous panelist mentioned, and to all the teachers who are teaching to the test, which is what you would naturally expect them to do, because that's what they're told to do, and that's where the incentives lie for them. And that is just an absolute disaster. And so we need to start looking at reforms, I think, in that area to try to bring some more dynamic elements to K-12.
I think that's a pretty good narrative on K-12. Mark, can you expand? I'm going to give you the task of higher education. What do you think higher education's role ought to be in fostering innovation? Is it in the classroom, is it in the laboratory or the research center? Where does it lie, and what ought we be thinking about moving forward?
Well, I think it's probably two areas. One is the transfer and the encouragement of entrepreneurial activity by the universities to its students and to the community in which it resides. And the other, of course, is how do you take the innovations that come out of a university and turn them into businesses so that the innovation becomes real in the marketplace? So I think there are two sort of issues. One is the entrepreneurial. If you look at that, I think Indiana is really very impressive in the number of entrepreneur programs we have. We have award-winning programs. Like Purdue has one, IU has one, award-winning entrepreneurship. We have 20 research technology parks in the state. And that we were the first to have a research park. was, the Purdue's research part was the first in the country. This was 20-some years ago, I think it was. And we have all these programs to help entrepreneurship and spur new companies. But then you look at some of the national yardsticks for how we're doing in the creation of new businesses, and we're not doing as well. So it's almost like we get the ideas, but we don't necessarily have the ideas create new companies. In fact, we're in the last quarter in the whole country for the number of new SME, small and mid-sized enterprises that are started. So I think that there are great examples all over this country of entrepreneur programs that result in more businesses. And we ought to look at that as a state and see which of those models can we try to replicate. One of the things that came up earlier was how do you bring the business community into the innovation process at the universities? And I think it was Christian mentioned that. And I've noticed this just being near Purdue, that there is a gulf between the two cultures. There's no question, everybody understands that. But are there bridge mechanisms that we can use? I loved Dr. Crawford, I believe was from Notre Dame, the STEAM program, in which you don't just have research for the intellectual joy of research. You have research that's translational in the sense that you're already looking at a potential application, and you're already adjusting your research targets, 10%, 20%, whatever it is, so that it's going to have an outcome in the real world. That doesn't mean you stop looking at the intellectual side of this and becoming a good researcher, but it does mean that you have one eye on the application and one eye on the discovery. Now, are there other ways we can do that? Should we, for instance, invite business executives and entrepreneurs to be in residence at certain faculties at Purdue or IU or Ball State and have them be these bridge figures? Is that a way to do it? Purdue has some interesting ideas that actually gets back into the high schools. It's called the Entrepreneurship Academy, in which you try to give the high school kids the idea of actually being an entrepreneur, a do-it sort of, not just theoretical. See, so I think as a state, we have these great intellectual assets. We have some great companies. If we can marry them to and figure out a better mechanism to take the fruits of the research and have it be translated into the fruits of a business successfully, we can really make a big impact on the future of, that's innovation in a real sense, taking discovery, making it real in the marketplace.
Thanks. And I'd like, before we run out of time, I'd like to sort of shift away from the particulars of education. You know, I was asked by a legislator a couple of weeks ago, how come is it that we have, you know, 2 of the top 10 entrepreneurship programs in the country here in Indiana, one at IU and one at Ball State, and we have a very large entrepreneurial minor at Purdue, and yet we're having these challenges, and I wonder, I couldn't have a good answer for him, and so I'm going to turn to Nick, whose book is titled From Poverty to Prosperity, Intangible Assets, Hidden Liabilities, and the Lasting Triumph Over Scarcity. By the way, he's promised me 10% of all the royalties on this sale. And I'm going to ask him, what are those intangible assets? We've talked about K through 12. We talked about higher education. I want to talk about what are the intangible assets that the U.S. has, and what have you discovered in your book?
Well, this builds on comments you made at the outset. I mean, the germ of the idea of the book was that the economics has changed. Our understanding of how the economy works has changed in a fundamental way. One is, whereas we used to focus on tangible factors of production, things like land, labor, and capital. Those are the things that we could look at and see and feel and touch, and we thought, and this is 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, well, if we can understand that mix, we can understand how economies grow and thrive. But as it turned out, that wasn't the case. You could have lots of labor and capital, as you do in lots of developing countries, and you don't have vibrant economies. And so there was this puzzle, which is why is it that some economies do so extraordinarily well, like the United States, and they're at the technology frontier, and others are laggards. And what we started looking at, we interviewed a number of folks who've been looking at this in the economics field, but there are other areas of social science where academics have been looking at it, are intangible factors. So Douglas North, for example, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, talks about the role of institutions. And by institutions, he means, it's not really the sort of right word for what he means, because when you say institution to somebody, you think, well, something very clearly delineated, like the Meridian Institute or the Smithsonian Institution or something like that. But what what Arnold Kling, my co-author, and I call in the book, what he's really talking about are protocols, which are rules for behavior, rules for engagement. And these can be things that are very clearly articulated and written down. It could be a constitution, a Bill of Rights. Those are institutions, how our country is instituted. They can also be much more informal norms, culture, attitudes about things like progress, attitudes about things like technology and change, attitudes about job loss and job creation. One of the enormous advantages that the United States has had over other countries is having this intangible quality, which has been very welcoming to economic change, very welcoming to technology. You don't find this in other countries. We may think, well, you know, on it, on the long-term consequences of it. Yet millions of Americans have gone out and gotten LASIK eye surgery and helped push this field, advance it, and make it something that's now pretty routine. You can walk in for $1,000 and get your eyes fixed. You know, people rushed out to get iPhones before they knew what they were. The United States has been this incredibly welcoming environment for technologists, for entrepreneurs, people who start businesses. It's an extraordinary market for that. Not every country is like that. So these intangible qualities are really important. Now, how that relates exactly to Indiana today, the people in this room might know better than I. Indiana has a phenomenal entrepreneurial history of great entrepreneurs who are great wealth builders. Where that is today exactly, you might know, you know, whether or not young entrepreneurs want to stay in Indiana, work here, build businesses here. That may be a challenge. Some things may have changed. I don't know, but the United States remains today a remarkable entrepreneurial culture, and that's it's hard to put a value on that in the way that you could value a factory or a traditional factor of production, but it is enormously consequential for the economic success and growth of the United States. And it's something I think we need to maintain and perpetuate.
One of the things that has proven frustrating to me over the past 15 years that I've been an economist is how mainstream these ideas are in economics. You interviewed Paul Romer. Most of you won't know who he is. His wife is Christina Romer, who up until just a few weeks ago was head of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Obama. And he wrote a paper in 1991 with Gregory Mankiw, many of whom you may not know, who up until 2008 was head of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Bush. And so these are two guys who sort of provided the human capital measures that are used today and the models that are used today for the importance of human capital. And in their model of international economies, they looked at health and education and institutions as well in their discussion. But I wonder if there's a natural tension between the preservation of this culture of innovation or technology and efforts by economic development organizations or state or local federal government to nurture them. Is there a place where government goes too far? Are we striking the right balance? Where are we on this, Mark?